Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Welcome to Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team, your trusted source for timely updates, expert insights, and practical tips for the dairy community. I'm your host, Jen Bentley, Dairy Field Specialist with ISU Extension and Outreach, and I'm here today along with my colleagues, Gail Carpenter, our State Extension Dairy Specialist, and Fred Hall, our Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist. So whether you're on the farm, in the barn, or on the road, we're glad you're tuning in to us today. So thanks for joining me, Gail and Fred.
Great to be here, Jen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, another topic on corn silage. It's coming in right now. I know we were talking before the podcast. Some are already done and some are rolling and some are probably going to get rolling this week. So we are going to have another episode on corn silage. And today we're lucky to have with us Dr. Luis Ferreiro. He's our associate professor and extension specialist in ruminant nutrition at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he brings a wealth of expertise in forage quality and silage management. And today we'll be discussing best practices for silage harvest and storage to help our producers maximize that feed value and minimize losses this year. So thanks for joining us, Luis.
Oh, thank you. Always a pleasure to join and be able to discuss corn silage.
Yeah, so we were just talking before that you haven't seen very many silage harvest out yet. And I know in my area, Northeast, it's probably going to be rolling here in the next week or a couple days. So how about what have you seen in your area?
Yeah, I think the expectation is to start sometime this week. For our university dairy, more likely next week. So I think we are very close.
Yeah, and here in Central Iowa, the Iowa State Dairy just finished on Labor Day. Just finished up our corn silage harvest. Our beef farm's gonna be a little bit later, but yeah, it came in pretty quick. I think we were feeling pretty comfortable, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh crap, we got to get started.
That kind of brings up the point, Louise. What's the target that producers should be looking for?
Yeah, I think that it's getting harder and harder to decide target. And the reason why I'm saying this, Fred, is that there are two different ways that we typically use to determine if the harvest timing is optimal, right? One would be dry matter or moisture concentration, and the other one would be kernel milk line, right? My impression, and we do have some data on that too, is that there is a disparity between those two metrics, and they are getting more and more distant depending on the year, the type of hybrid, and so on, right? So in my opinion, we have to target for both to make sure that we make the most informed decision that we can and can properly target that. Said that, I think that I'm gonna give you two ranges here, one for each of those two metrics, but we obviously have some flexibility, right? If I could choose the perfect scenario, I'll tell you that from a dry matter perspective, I like corn silage that's between 33 and 37%. Obviously, if you are between 30 and 40%, you should be fine regardless, right? I think is a good metric. But if we could put a smaller range into that perspective, that's what I would consider. And if possible, I would like to see a kernel milk line between 2/3 and 3/4 of that kernel line, so we don't lose much starch, right? Because at the end of the day, we have to make this decision based on what is the optimum yield and what is the optimum quality that we can get. And the longer we wait, more we accumulate in the field, but the more we wait, also more we have issues with quality, right? Because we have lower digestibility. So we have kind of figure out for each dairy what's the ideal scenario and go from there.
So to some extent, you can make up for losses in fiber digestibility with a higher energy feed because with a lower milk line, you get more starch, right? So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. Okay, maybe our fiber is not quite as digestible with a drier feed, but maybe we've sacrificed a little bit and we get more layup close to that 3/4 milk line. Now, the other thing to think about though is feed that's too dry is not going to, you say quality. Quality can mean digestibility. It can also mean like molds, toxins, packing's not, packing's not going as well. We can't get it as packed as we'd like. So where are we kind of in that danger zone of dry matter that like, okay, like fiber digestibility aside, we're worried about actually getting this packed?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And not only fiber digestibility, starch digestibility also goes down as maturity progresses, right?
Right,
Because
right.
the same way we have more lignin for fiber, we have more prolamine with the kernels for starch. So we have exactly the same deal, right?
Yeah.
I also don't think that more starch fixes 100% of the lack of digestible fiber because low fiber digestibility may compromise intake, right?
Right.
So if you have a lot of very poor digestibility silage, the cows will not eat. So it's the same as not having enough because you're going to have to buy feed anyway.
Yeah.
So I do think we have to figure out what that threshold is. But the other point that you brought about fermentation is also key because the drier the material is, worse it is for fermentation because bacteria definitely needs water for that process. And we can clearly see that as you start seeing a change from 30 to 40% dry matter, the total acids that will be accumulating starts to decrease, right? If you go to through research literature. And the other concern is also related to what you mentioned about more time in the field, very likely bringing more yeast and molds or any other microorganisms to the silo, which later on will compromise its stability, right? And obviously, the drier material is also harder to harvest. So because of that, you may end up with coarser particles, and then you may have more issues with packing density and fermentation in general. So all those have to be taken into consideration. My threshold for problems is 40%. But I cannot just tell you harvest at the maximum of 40% because there is a huge standard deviation for dry matter if you start going through all your fields or even within the same field, right? So if we use the 40% average, it very likely means that you're harvesting from, I don't know, 37 to 43%, maybe more than that, depending on the variation you have for the year in your fields. So because of that, I like the 33 to 37% because this way you are within that 30 to 40% range because you also don't want to go too low in dry matter, not just because of yield, but also because you start having a lot of issues with effluent loss, which also cause other issues in fermentation and quality of the silage later on.
So timing, we have a little bit of a Goldilocks thing going on, right? Like, or we have to compromise at some point. Especially like you said, it seems more and more common now that we have to make some of these compromises. Where maybe okay, it's not milk line's not quite where we want it to be, but we need to get it in before it's dried off, dried down too much, that sort of thing. Some of this we can maybe compensate for a little bit though with our processing techniques, right? So maybe we can chop it a little bit finer. Maybe we can increase that starch digestibility with some better kernel processing, and that can kind of maybe help us manage. It's good practices anyway, but also helps us manage some of those compromises that we have to make. So what should people be thinking about as optimum when we're talking about? Actually, we said chop length and kernel processing, but I'll throw chop height in there too. How can we use those to manage corn silage?
Yeah, those are all key factors, right? And I think we have to pay very close attention. The chop length and kernel processing should be decided based on not only the needs of each farm, but also related to timing, right? And the reason for that is if you have to harvest drier material, very likely you need to be more aggressive for kernel processing because those kernels, they are harder. There is a myth in the industry that tells you that, oh, because those kernels are harder, they will shatter more. But this is not real. Okay, this is just a problem with the corn silage processing score metric because anybody that harvests immature corn silage have a lot of those kernels that are smashed, and those kernels cannot pass through the 4.75 millimeter sieve, giving you the impression that processing is not good. But that kernel is fully open and the starch is fully available. So I just wanted to mention that because this may be a complicated metric to evaluate from that perspective. But at the same time, you want to make sure you have finer particles, because at the end of the day, if you are harvesting drier material, very likely your particles will be longer. And the longer those particles are, more oxygen will be entrapping during packing. So it takes longer, right? So you have to spend more time packing, which is not always a possibility, right? Especially because you have a lot of trucks coming to the silo. You need to have well timed and everything. So from that perspective, it has to be adjusted together, right? So my suggestion is if you go drier, you have to be more aggressive with processing and make sure that you have a shorter theoretical length of cut. If you harvest more or closer to 30%, then you have to start opening a little bit the kernel processor as well as the particle size, because you want to make sure you are not pretty much macerating those particles, right? Which later on will be a problem from an effluent perspective as well. So if I could put a target for people to think about, and I know that's very hard because it will change based on processor and how new those processors are, how fast people harvest, and other factors. I like seeing a kernel processor gap between 1 and 3 millimeters. I think that's pretty much standard for anybody that's harvesting silage at this point. More than that will make quite hard to break a lot of kernels, and we do need to do that. Regardless of if you're talking about immature or mature corn silage, if you don't break kernels, very likely your cows will not be able to utilize that starch, right? And from a particle size perspective, obviously will depend which fiber that you have in addition to corn silage for your diet, because you need to make sure you have effective fiber. But I think in the last few years, we moved from longer particles, and by longer particles, understand the 19 millimeter sieve of the Penn State shaker box, for those of you that use the shaker box, to maybe focusing more on the 8 millimeter sieve to make sure that the cows are unable to sort at the feed bunk. And don't let the cows fool you, because they will sort. They have their wills, and they will do that very, very well, better than we can imagine. Said that, I think that my initial target, and then we have to adjust based on dry matter and other things, would be probably between 16 and 19 millimeters for a conventional processor, and very likely around 22 millimeters for a shredlage processor, because with the shredlage you have the, let's say, the luxury of opening a little bit more the length of cut, so you can have good processing regardless. Now, you also ask about shop height, and shop height is a tough topic to put a number into it, because it will depend on what your normal shop height is, and obviously the way or the design of your fields probably play a major role to that. Okay. But I think that in years that we have good productivity, and this year may be the case for some producers, not all as usual, I think is a good year to consider that. And why is that? The reason is you may be trading, again, yield for quality, similar to what we discussed with maturity. But if you're able to increase a little bit your shop height, very likely you're leaving a little bit more lignin from the bottom part of the plant in the field, and you have more digestible fiber. The benefit of shop height is also that you are increasing the starch concentration by dilution, because it's the same year diluted by less plant material, so you don't have the downside that we typically see when harvesting earlier, right? But you do increase dry matter as well, so you have to be a little bit careful so you don't reach those thresholds that could compromise fermentation.
One of the big topics in my part of the world is disease pressure that we've seen. Have you got any insights on what you think these diseases will do from milk per acre?
Yeah, I think that it depends on what type of disease and the potential issue that we're going to see. I think that one of the main concerns that I have with any disease would be all the microorganisms that we are bringing to the silo, and how much faster the dry down would be whenever we have any sort of pressure, right? If you like harvesting silage a little bit later, this is doable when you have healthy plants, but whenever you have disease pressure, you have to be really careful because at the moment you start to see the dry down getting faster and faster, you have to go there and harvest. The problem is you don't know when that is, right? So you have to be there and harvesting. The other issue is whenever you have disease pressure, you are bringing more yeasts and molds to the silo. So we made an exercise a couple years ago that we have been using for presentations now, where we try to mimic a study that was doing in vitro by showing that if you have a lot of yeasts reaching silage yeast or wild yeast reaching the rumen fluid, there is a detrimental effect on fiber digestibility of samples that were not contaminated with that yeast. So based on that lack or negative effect on fiber digestibility, we calculated the potential downside using the milk per ton, and it's about 100 to 150 pounds per ton that we see there. Obviously, this is a prediction, right? So we have to be careful with that. But if you go to the literature and you see some of the studies that fed silage that had issues with yeast contamination, every single study shows lower milk production. So this is one of the potential downsides that we can see with some of those disease pressures that you're seeing.
We had recently a webinar on our I-29 with our I-29 group about forages. And the first speaker talked about tar spot in silage corn. Would encourage our listeners to go check that out. She talked a lot about some of the potential economic implications of disease pressure. And it was really interesting. So if any of our listeners want to check it out, i-29muu.com/forages, and it's right there at the top of the page to go check out. We also did a podcast episode, I believe it was posted last week, with our agronomist Shelby Gruss. She talked about some of these issues as well. We talked a lot about how quickly these things dry down, as well as some of the increased risk for these yeasts and molds. Another thing that she mentioned that, I mean, we can't really do much about it right now, but grain fill. And then after we recorded, I had an opportunity to go walk some fields with Shelby, and we looked at some ears of corn, and yeah, sure enough, a lot less grain fill than we'd like to see on some of those ears too. So again, reducing the quality of that silage from a nutritional perspective. So.
And tar spot is very complex because at the moment you see that you have and the plant starts drying down, is exactly as you said. It's much, much faster than the typical dry down. And sometimes what you have to do is just go ahead and harvest because at the end of the day, you don't want that accumulating and, well, it will just be deteriorating the plant overall, right? It's not only the grain field, it's also the leaves and everything else. So.
Can producers manage disease risk during harvest?
Unfortunately, at harvest, there's not much we can do, right? Because at this point, very likely the disease is already established. What we can do is time it so we can harvest at a point where it's not too bad yet, right? What the producers can do at harvest is make sure that they do a good job with the silage management. So whenever they open the silo, they don't have the downside of the yeasts proliferating too fast and creating issues associated with palatability, deterioration, and obviously milk production if that happens, right? I think that from that perspective, we should target first very good packing. We need to make sure that we remove as much air as possible to make sure that those yeasts cannot thrive under an environment that still has some oxygen, because yeasts do not survive well in an aerobic environment. They don't die though. They are just dormant, right? They will wake up whenever we open that silo. So we need to remember that because we think that, okay, now we killed them. Well, we actually didn't. They're just waiting for the meal. Whenever you open that silo, they come back and start everything again. But at the same time, we also have to consider which other technologies can help us with that. One of those technologies would be microbial inoculants. I'm a big fan of inoculants that are Buchneri based. And the reason for that is Buchneri produce lactic acid, but also produce acetic acid at a certain point in fermentation. And acetic acid is important because it helps delay this process with yeast proliferation, and then after that, the mold proliferation. So because of that, you have more time to be able to feed that crop without having issues with deterioration, palatability, and so on.
You brought up some good points about things that they can do, the good packing and using those inoculants. And once we get to post harvest and we're fermenting those feeds and we're starting to feed that out, what should be watching out for, or what are some tips to help monitor corn silage quality?
Yeah, I think it's very important to obviously pay attention to the visual yeast and molds, right, and remove those from what you put together for your TMR. But in addition to that, try to see silage temperature. And I don't have a specific threshold for temperature, but whenever you see that silage is warming up too fast or TMR is warming up too fast, you have an issue, right? So I think that's where you have to be very careful with. I think that the best suggestion would be try to have a clean face of the silo and don't have different areas of the silo being removed at different times, because then you maximize the air entrance after you open the silo. If you have a very clean face without many holes, I think you delay the process a lot. It's very important to do that. Try to do not uncover too much of the silo. Obviously, we also don't want people walking on top of silos multiple times. So you may need to figure out where is the perfect place there. So we also think about silo safety, right? Because we want to make sure people are safe when doing that. And also, if possible, try to remove enough material for the day, not a couple days in advance. I was at the silage conference meeting this year, which only happens every 3 years. And one of the nice presentations that we saw there was a palatability study with heifers, dairy heifers, from the Miner Institute. And basically what they did is they fed silage from the day or from the day before. And what they saw is that the heifers prefer silage defaced the same day. And it's not that they knew, right? Nobody went there and say, hey, that's what you have here, that's what you have there, right? There's something in that silage that told them you should prefer this silage. And could be temperature, could be smell, could be anything, right? But they knew. So I think it's important that we pay close attention to that. And if we tie that to the discussion about yeast and molds, very likely that's the reason for that, right? There is yeast and mold proliferation. So probably there are some undesired fermentation end products that are being created by those. And very likely they didn't want to eat because they know that they would produce less. Well, in this case, it's heifers. They would gain less weight, right? Instead of producing less milk. But it's the same outcome, right? You are minimizing animal performance when that happens.
What do you see in new silage research that you can share with us that producers ought to be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I think that some of the main areas that we are seeing research now, uh, they are areas that we always had research, but with a few new technologies, right? One of those is hybrids. So this short corn hybrids, we receive a lot of questions about them. It seems to be something that will gain a lot of popularity after we see them more and more in the field. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of published research, right? We are fortunate that we see some of those results, but that's something that I believe will be quite popular in the future. What I don't know is how much we'll have to adapt to plant, harvest, and utilize those. So probably this is an area that will get everybody excited about, but not have any answers. But definitely this is one of the key areas. From a fermentation perspective, I think what we are seeing more and more is studies trying to not only test inoculants, because we do that for many years, but understand the use of inoculants under different circumstances or different situations. And I think that's quite important because some inoculants may work better or worse depending on what the scenario is. And I think that we have to understand that. For example, under high temperatures, sometimes some inoculants struggle a little bit more, right? Which tell us to be very careful about our packets or bottles or whatever you use for your inoculants, right? We need to store that well to make sure that those are good. We make sure that we add to water that's not boiling, right? Depending on when you are harvesting that and so on. Another set of research that I saw recently that I think is very interesting, and this research that's not easy to run, is about uh, covering, right? And I'm a big fan of oxygen barrier. I should have mentioned that earlier when we were talking about the fermentation issues. And those different covers, especially for walls now, people are testing more and more wall covers. Those are key, and the results that we see in the literature matches the visual observations we see in the field. So if you can properly cover your walls and make sure you have a very good oxygen barrier to minimize the gap between the plastic and the silage on top, that goes a long way too.
You'd mentioned those short corn genetics out there. Is that going to replace the BMR genetics that we appear to be losing?
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't think we have enough studies with short corn to tell us if it works the same way or better or worse than BMR. Uh, I'm aware of only two feeding trials. One of those is from Europe, so we have to be careful because it's different genetics than what we have here, and didn't compare BMR. So it's hard to tell you if we can replace that. The other study is from Michigan State and did compare BMR, but the digestibility of BMR in vivo was worse than the conventional. So I don't know if that study reflects the typical study we see with BMR. The short corn that they test performed quite well in terms of animal performance. So it gives us good perspective, right? I just don't know how good it is against BMR. I would like to see a few more studies done that way, or even against conventional hybrids, because we can start making some inference. But the few information we have suggests that fiber digestibility is really good, resembling some of the BMR digestibility. So maybe there is potential for that.
All right. I think that looks like that hits most of our questions. Any last words of advice that you wanna give, Luis?
The only other thing I want to say is if you want to check your shop height, we put together a tool that farmers could use to try to predict what the effect would be through UW extension. And basically, all you have to do is input what your normal corn silage looks like in terms of nutrient composition, what is your typical shop height. And then we also ask you to put the cost per acre that you have so you can see the cost per acre when you have less material, right? Which I do think is quite important. That gives you a good estimate of what your crop would look like if you increase shop height, and you can choose how higher that silage is chopped. What we don't do with that spreadsheet that is also important to consider is whenever you have higher chop, very likely you will be able to buy less corn, grain, right? Because you have a little bit more starch, and probably you don't need to use as much byproducts for fiber digestibility. So you may have changes in diet cost that we cannot predict with that too. And I'm just saying that so people do a more thorough exercise than what we just suggested you to do with that too. But it's good to check and see if it makes sense for you, especially because you see that there is a new drop and you want to make sure you account for your forage inventories.
That sounds like a great tool, Louise. I think we'll make sure we include that in our show notes here, get that link out to our producers so we make sure that they can access that as well. So, and along with some of the other resources that Gail, you provided with some of the previous podcasts, and Fred, I know we had a webinar maybe last year or 2 years ago with Luis on corn silage harvesting and processing. That may be a good review for people who want to see some of those slides that Luis covered.
I think
Anything
it's safe
else?
to say that Luis is one of our favorite contacts when it comes to questions about corn silage. So we are very happy to have him near us and his willingness to collaborate with us on educating producers.
Oh, and whenever you need, just let me know. Always glad to discuss corn silage or any other nutrition topic of interest. So.
Well, that sounds great. And I think that's all for today's episode of Dairy News and Views from ISU. I want to thank Dr. Luis Ferretto for sharing your expertise and insights with us. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with your fellow dairy producers and professionals. And for more resources and upcoming events and expert support, you can always visit our website, extension.iastate.edu/dairy team. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and keep making a difference in the dairy industry. Thank you. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.